In 2006, I went to Afghanistan. I was NATO's head of air transport for the ISAF mission, the International Security Assistance Force. And when I came back home, I had been transformed, and not in a very good way. I was rather angry and irritated and suddenly spending a fortune on speeding tickets. I was easily startled by loud noises and slept very lightly. I remember waking up one night to what sounded to me like shooting outside, and it was a frightening experience. I couldn't find my bulletproof vest. I couldn't find my weapon. I couldn't even find my clothes. And then there was this male hand touching me saying, "Everything's all right, don't worry." It took me quite some time to realize that that was my husband comforting me in the safety of my own bed in the Netherlands. You might wonder, why is she so touchy? Well, let me take you back to Afghanistan. I worked at the headquarters. It's stationed at the capital, Kabul. And Kabul is at an altitude of 1,800 meters high. And even though it's at 1,800 meters high, it's still in a valley. And it's surrounded by high mountains with perennial snow, the Himalayas. And we knew that every night we went to bed, the enemy, whomever that may be, might go up those mountains and shoot rocket-propelled grenades at our camp. Again. So every night I went to bed, I would put out my clothes like that. Boots still in the trousers, bulletproof vest next to it, so I could leave for the bunker within 20 seconds after the alarm went off. It's a state of high alert that doesn't magically wear off the moment you come back to the Netherlands. And it was not something new, because in mission preparation we were told that when you came back you might feel weird, you might need to readjust. But I wondered how many others have this as well. And no matter how many people I asked, nobody could tell me at the time, even though we do get debriefed extensively. They didn't even have a name for this returning home blues. And the broader question, does war affect soldiers, is a very important one if you just consider how many lives it affects. Just to the war in Afghanistan in the last 15 years, hundreds of thousands of soldiers have been deployed. So, as a military scientist, I'm specialized in military memoirs, I was intrigued. And I decided to read up to see what other scientists had to say about it. The first name that immediately popped up was Paul Fussell. He wrote a classical study about the experiences of First World War soldiers. And he said those young men went into the war with the romantic notion that war would turn them into a real man, maybe even a hero. Instead, the First World War turned out to be awful. Life in the trenches, the fear of poison gas, the constant nearness of death and destruction. So instead of turning them into heroes, the war turned them into victims. So Fussell concluded that modern 20th century soldiers write about disillusionment because of the atrocities of modern warfare. And other researchers agreed with him. Then, in 2008, more than 30 years later, comes Harari. And Harari disagrees. He says, it's not so much that modern wars are particularly more awful. It is that modern people, including modern soldiers, have other expectations of life. They expect life to be a series of experiences, to bring them something. And war, then, is the ultimate experience. And Harari says that ultimate experience can be one of disillusionment. I had high expectations and they didn't come true. However, quite the opposite is also possible. Those are growth stories. War has turned me from a naive young man or woman into a mature person. Not so much a hero, but somebody who's grown from his or her experiences. So, who's right? Fussell or Harari? They both agree that war changes soldiers, but one of them says it's just negative and the other says it could also be positive. And if Harari is right, what's the ratio between positive and negative stories? Not even Harari knows. So, As a military scientist, I was now really intrigued, and I decided to find out. Having written a military memoir about my own experiences in Afghanistan, I decided to study every military Afghanistan memoir I could find and read from 5 different countries: the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, Canada, and of course, the Netherlands. I found 54 in total, published up to 2010. And based on a characterization by Friedman, I found all sorts of different stories. I found 40% disillusionment stories, but I also found 30% growth stories, like Harari predicted. And I found a lot of other stories as well, like action plots and sentimentals stories. All in all, more than half the books had positive stories. So Harari was right. Modern soldiers not only experience disillusionment, but many of them have other experiences, including growth stories. And what about my experiences? Could they be found back in those books? Well, they looked a little bit like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which was characterized at the time by 3 things: hyperarousal, like my being scared of loud noises; intrusive re-experiencing, think flashbacks and nightmares; and avoidance and numbing. And in order for you to be diagnosed with PTSD, you need to have at least 6 of those kind of symptoms. I only had 1, hyperarousal, so I don't have PTSD, but 6 of those authors, 1 in 9, was diagnosed with PTSD. Then I found a scholar who actually had a name for what I had. And her name was Louise Weibull. And she called it post-deployment disorientation. And I love that term. You come back, post, from a deployment, and you feel a little disoriented. And she said, even Swedish soldiers who've been on a very peaceful mission where nothing out of the ordinary, say nightly risk of rocket-propelled grenades, happens, even they come back with this feeling of post-deployment disorientation. And it's a feeling of alienation, but it also looks a bit like those PTSD-like symptoms. So I looked through the books to see if they were described. And they were described extensively. British soldiers, like Dutch soldiers, are warned for them, for instance. Duke Beatty, for instance, writes, "You're told your mood will change without warning. You'll get angry, sad, depressed, resentful, and you won't know why. You might start drinking too much, driving too aggressively, arguing unnecessarily, picking fights for no good reason." I thought, yes, that sounds familiar. When I came back from my deployment, I could no longer limit myself to 100 kilometers an hour on motorways. I could sacrifice my life in Afghanistan, and I couldn't even drive 120. Hence the speeding tickets. The other things were also described extensively, like Niels Roeller. He writes about alienation. He writes in third person and in Dutch, so I'll give you my translation. "The first few days he was just happy to be home and mainly very tired. Now that mist has slowly dissipated and it's hard on him. He doesn't feel right at home in the Netherlands yet. He's more silent than usual and often seemed to have his mind on other things." The PTSD-like symptoms were also described very often by, for instance, by American infanterist Johnny Rico. "The fireworks explode like colorful spiders over the Hawaii beach, and I jump. I lean forward from my chair and tap Ryan on the shoulder. 'Holy shit, did you see that?' 'What?' Ryan asks. 'Check it out,' I say. I wait for the next explosion, and my body jumps slightly." I had exactly the same. Intrusive re-experiencing, also described very often, for instance by American pilot Michael Franzak. His nightmare started when he came home. Worse were the dreams about the hospital. Again, I was alone, walking through the ICU, looking at the bandaged children lying in the hospital beds, wrapped in gauze, missing arms, legs, eyes. The wounded children just stared at me, expressionless faces. I looked around for a nurse, a doctor, someone, but there wasn't anyone. And a beautiful example of avoidance and numbing is given by German paratrooper Robert Eckholt, once again in my translation. I couldn't understand why after such a short period of time I wasn't the same person I was before the deployment, and I withdrew more and more, also because I felt unrecognized. Friendships and my relationship with my partner broke up, as I was no longer interested in maintaining them. So I was very relieved to see that I was not the only one with post-deployment disorientation. In fact, half the books that not only describe the mission in Afghanistan, but also the homecoming, mention at least one, but often more of those symptoms. So they're very common. So by now, the conclusion should be clear. Yes, war affects soldiers, and it can affect them negatively, but it can definitely also affect them positively. For me personally, I no longer have any problems. As expected, my post-deployment disorientation went away. I no longer feel jumpy when I hear loud noises, and I no longer get any more speeding tickets, though I must confess to 2 parking tickets lately. So I've transformed back again. But not entirely, not entirely. As you may have understood by now, the art form that I'm in love with is books. And paintings have never been able to touch me. Until, after my deployment, I saw this painting by Steph Friedel. And it shocked me. This, like the books I studied, is a self-portrait of a soldier who's been to Afghanistan and who's been changed. So, having heard all this, what should you do with this information? Should you have pity on soldiers? Nah. Professional soldiers know that war may change them, so please don't pity us. But do provide us with an appreciation of the work we do, providing stability and security in unstable parts of the world, because that's what we crave. Your recognition. Thank you.